Seeing none, we will move to our agenda item. We will be having special education by the numbers presentation. And is that Mr. Willis? Oh, yes. I apologize. We did have kind of a last-minute agenda ad here. We are going to have just a brief presentation on the Midwestern Higher Education Compact first. My apologies. Welcome to committee.
There. Thank you, Madam Chair and members. Okay, this is the clicker, right? Let's see if I can get this. Do I point it at it? Where do I go? How do I do this? All right, I'm just going to go. The technology will actually catch up to me for once. Madam Chair and members, my name is Susan Heegard. I'm the president of the Midwestern Higher Education Compact, or of course in higher education, we love our acronyms, MEC. And I'm joined by my colleague, Sophie Mancino. And Sophie, this is Sophie's first state capital visit, and she's fresh off the press, having graduated from college in Wisconsin in 2023. So I'm just going to walk through the slides that we've handed out and shared with you. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them if I hear, and if I can't, I'm happy to answer them later on. Our compact was founded in 1991. Kansas was one of the first states to join the compact. And we were actually legislative created through the Council of State Governments, CSG. And we have 60 commissioners and alternates, and I'll share who those are with you in just a second. Every state that's part of the compact, there are 12 in the Midwest, so we're the Midwest Census Region, pays a $115,000 commitment. In exchange for that, you get access to our various programs and services. Our commissioners, you can see up here on the up here, or you can see in the slides that I've handed out, but we have 5 commissioners and 2 alternates. We have a vacancy currently in the Senate with the retirement of Senator Molly Baumgartner, who was just terrific and made so many contributions to our compact. So if you're interested and would like to be involved, that appointment, I think, is going to be made shortly. So what's our value to the state? I think that's very, very important for us to be able to share with you. We have 2 sides of our business. We have our cost savings programs and contracts, and then our policy and research. So I'll talk a little bit about both of those things now. In terms of our cost savings contracts and programs, we have technology, hardware, software, and services, student health insurance, and then we've had insurance programs over the years. We also, there's a savings to the state through distance education, and I'll share that with you as well. In terms of cost savings for Kansas, I'm on slide 5 on page 3 of the handout. That's $5.34 million in total annual savings for Kansas colleges, universities, school districts, states, and local governments. And then students and their families save some money as well through a reciprocity program. Your return on investment, you're a good user of our programs, and so your return is fairly high, 46-fold. You save $1.63 million on the technology, so the 2 ways in which you save there, and that's actually a program that higher education, K-12 school districts, and local units of government can take advantage of. And in your packet, there's a list of a user list, so you'll see all the way down to the fire department or the library, who uses our contracts. And sometimes they don't even know that they're using the contract. The Dell representative or someone will say, hey, this is a great contract, you should use it. It's turnkey and ready to go. So there's a 10% average savings on the bulk purchasing aspect of the contract, but really the big pitch I think that I'd like to make is that we negotiate on behalf of the state. And so we can, because we're an instrumentality of state government, we can do all those negotiations. It's turnkey and ready to go. And then the contract can be tailored by the user as they see fit. In addition to the savings for technology, that 1.63 million, there's 1.73 million savings on distance education through the Midwestern State Authorization Reciprocity Agreement, another acronym that I did not invent, but that's, it's called SARA, S-A-R-A. And basically what that means is before this program was in existence, if you were a higher education institution, public or private, and you wanted to offer a distance education program in another state, you had to register for business in every single state where you wanted to do that. It was terribly expensive. Now you just have to do it once if you meet certain quality standards, and the institutions save a whole bunch of money in doing that. There also are 7,401 students at 7 Kansas institutions that participate in our student health insurance program. And then there's also some savings that occur to families through the reciprocity agreement that we have that allows students to attend college in other states. That would sit along some of those state-to-state reciprocity programs. I live in Minnesota, so Minnesota and Wisconsin have a fierce rivalry on many levels, and we also have a reciprocity between just those two states. But this is more of a regional reciprocity program. We're actually taking a hard look at that right now. For some of the demographics have changed a bit, and so we're trying to figure out, does that need a refresh? Some of the other benefits for Kansas at the bottom of slide 3 in your handout. We identify issues that pop up across the region, and then we try to bring people together sort of in a way that allows them to problem solve together. So one of those would be the very significant cost of textbooks. I have 2 college students who just graduated, and Sophie just finished, and she even told me that she often wouldn't even buy her textbooks because they were too expensive. So open education resources, or OER, are an alternative to textbooks, or they can sit alongside textbooks. They're free to the student. But they do cost something, for the developer to create. But it allows for very tailored programming and curriculum to be developed for students. So we've piloted that program, gotten some funding for it from a foundation, and we're sharing those best practices across the Midwest. In addition, we heard a lot about the problem with the FAFSA, the Federal Student Aid Application, all the problems in general with it, even before they changed it and tried to simplify it, which actually made it more complicated. So we brought people together in a summit. You had quite a few attendees from Kansas come, and those sessions really involved everything from how do you get a bill to pass if you want to do FAFSA statewide. It's a really interesting issue because you'll have a state like Illinois and a state like Indiana, who are adopting statewide FAFSA. Very conservative state, much less conservative state, together approaching this in a similar way. In addition, trying to develop ways in which we can help students learn how to fill the FAFSA form out, because if you don't fill it out, you're leaving money on the table. It's critical to do that. I know from my own experience. We also have a program focused on concurrent enrollment, so we're trying to look at best practices with respect to concurrent enrollment. It looks very different in many states. The student can attend college, their high school student can attend college classes, or the college class in some cases can be taught back in the high school, but what's the best way to provide access and then pay for that program? So we have brought groups together with respect to that as well. Now I just have quickly a few slides to share with you on the demographic picture for your state. I don't know why the slides aren't coming up on here, but I'm really sorry about that. You should have those loaded. I don't know why they're not coming up. But anyway, you've got the handout, and so I'm going to start with the big number, which is attainment. And attainment is the educatedness of your state, meaning any credential beyond high school. So you'll see on slide 6 on page 4 that you tick above the national average. You have 56% of your folks have some post-secondary certificate or higher, compared to 54% nationally. My favorite slide is this one. It's a horizontal chart here that shows how these various credentials shake out across the board. So this basically shows you that in your state, 44% of residents don't have any credential beyond high school, meaning like a certificate even. So 8% of your folks have no high school diploma, 24% have a high school diploma, 12% have some college, but not a credential yet. And then like the purple and the green would represent certifications. We're getting better at counting those. Green would be a college certificate, a 2-year. Blue would be a bachelor's, and the rust-colored number, 14%, are graduate degrees. And so I think the point is, like in your state, you've got a very strong aviation industry, you've got a very strong agriculture industry. You want to be able to have broad credentials, so techs as well as people that maybe have science degrees or, engineering degrees and that sort of thing. So these are just, this is just information to inform you from a variety of perspectives. The next one is enrollment. We know that this is an issue all across the Midwest in particular, that the number of high school graduates in Kansas is projected to decline over the next decade, driven by a decrease among white graduates, while the number of non-white graduates, they would, in your state, it would probably be mostly Hispanic. That would be where you'd see the growth. Are actually staying stable or growing. So that's a pretty typical picture of what's happening across the Midwest. Then you couple that with enrollment. So enrollment on slide 11, page 6. Undergraduate enrollment has declined at public 2-year colleges over the last decade, and at public 4-year colleges starting in 2016-17, although graduate enrollment has ticked up a little bit. So you'd see some differences, for example, at the University of Kansas or Kansas State, where they actually can bring in more out-of-state students, but those enrollments are declining. Some of that has to do with, birth rate, and some of it also, in fact, may have to do with people moving to other places, and that, again, is a problem and challenge across the Midwest. The next slide on number 12 on page 6 shows you that the good news is that more students come into your state, migrate in, than migrate out. So you're a net importer of students. Unlike Minnesota or Illinois, we lose more students. So the question there is, then that's just a year after high school graduation. What happens to them after that? Do they stay in your state? And are there strategies and things you can focus on with respect to your economy and various things that would allow those students to get good jobs and stay here and raise their families here? The other good news, I think, that a project with the U.S. Census Bureau has shown is that, I'm probably an example of this, and my whole family, 5 years out, even if people leave your state or leave for another state in the Midwest, they tend to come home after 5 or 10 years. They come home to be near their families and raise their kids. This other slide here is an enrollment slide, slide 13, and that shows you just another way of looking at the data that if they're going to leave, they're really only going to go into the Midwest. So the blue line would say 81% of your students stay in Kansas. That's a pretty high number compared to the rest of the Midwest. 9% leave for another Midwestern state. And then, I don't have my glasses on, 9% leave the region completely. The following slides are just 2 slides focused on net price, average net price. So we did, for 2-year college students on slide 14, we took the lowest income students in around $30,000 and then another patch of students around $100,000. So for the lowest income students, your average net price is higher than the Midwest and national averages and higher than your border states. We always put your border states in there. I don't know why that would be. However, for students from families of around $100,000, you're more competitive. You're not above those other states, as you can see. And then my final slide here is 4-year colleges. That would show you that the average net price for low-income students at public 4-year colleges is higher than the Midwest and national, but lower than Colorado, Missouri, and Nebraska, those border states. And again, for the $100,000 family versus the 30, you're a little more competitive there, which is really good news. So that's just a quick, sample or introduction to what our organization is, what we do. It's voluntary. We are written into statute, so there's an entire statute devoted to the compact, and it looks the same in all the states, and it looks pretty similar across the country. And then I thought it'd be fun to share some of this demographic information with you. I know you've got a busy agenda. Those user lists are on the back here, and if there's lots of good stuff on our website, including a data dashboard. We're here today and tomorrow, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, President Heegart. Committee, what questions do we have? I think you did just such a great job. They don't have any, but as you said, you will be around. So committee, if you do have any questions, let me know, or Cindy, or reach out to the president yourself.
Thank you, Madam
Thank you
Chair
so
and
much
members.
for being
Appreciate
here.
it. Thank you.
Okay, committee, now we will turn our attention to the special education by the numbers presentation by Mr. Willis.
Good afternoon, committee. Once again, for the record, I am Matthew Willis, Senior Research Analyst with KLRD. Today, I will be presenting to you Special Education 101, or just kind of an overview of special education, how it's set up in Kansas, how the infamous excess cost formula works, just a variety of those. I will note you should have I have kind of a hybrid combination of a lot of my testimony is online or is digital for you, but I do have kind of 3 handouts I'll be referencing that you should have physical copies for. And for everyone in the room, there are some over here on a table if you would like them to reference, as well as, again, everything should be either already online or Cindy will be getting it up with some of the stuff I sent towards the end. Some references that I might not necessarily be bringing up here, but that I did send out for you are KSDE publishes a very lengthy, like 400-page special education handbook that I had sent that goes over probably anything imaginable, as well as they also publish a parent's guide to special education that kind of focuses more on what a parent would need to know with all of it, but again, can kind of have some useful or handy kind of breakdowns for everything. So I will be working primarily off of, again, what you'll have as a digital memo, which is my Special Education 101, Requirements and Funding in Kansas. So special education, when we mostly think about it, we think about it as a federal requirement for the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Kansas also has a state act, the Special Education for Exceptional Children, which largely mirrors the federal one with a few differences. So one, Kansas does require gifted underneath it. So when you are tested and accepted to gifted, you will have an IEP, just like any other exceptionally found students. Kansas, I'm going to refer to it as SECA, requires districts to utilize interventions in the regular education classroom prior to referring a student to special education. School districts are required to provide special education services to eligible students within the district who are attending private school. And then 2, which are kind of more on the eligibility side, is a couple years ago, the legislature changed the eligibility term emotional disturbance to the term emotional disability. It is in statute saying that they equate the same for federal purposes, but when you look at any KSDE documents or anything, it will refer to it as emotional disability. Similarly, the legislature also added dyslexia as a specific eligibility for this. My understanding is it is generally, had been generally captured underneath kind of a broader learning disability category, but again, you will notice in documents it is now specifically called out because it is different than federal requirements. So as far as the administration of special education, SECA does establish that the State Board of Education is to adopt and administer the state plan for special education and adopt all rules and regulations necessary to comply with federal law. They also have further requirements that include, but are not limited to, establishing procedures for dispute resolution, establishing guidelines and standards for training, distributing and allocating state and federal funds for special education, and preparing and filing reports required by federal or state law. Beyond that, local districts are the ones responsible for actually providing the services to students, and that is where we will get to my first of my handouts, the nice colorful map. So in Kansas, there's kind of 3 different models that most districts are utilizing for that. You will notice the districts that are in white and not colored, those are the districts that are independently providing it. So as you'll see, not all, but most of them are more in kind of more urban areas. So for instance, 501 Topeka or 497 Lawrence are both white. Those 2 districts, they are responsible for hiring all the staff, for providing all the services, for taking care of all of the students that are within their district that require services. The other 2 models are what you'll see represented by all these different colors, and the back of the map will provide kind of a key for how those are grouped. Those are the cooperatives and the interlocals. It gets a bit confusing here because a lot of interlocals will have the word cooperative in their name, and functionally they're going to be similar for how students are receiving services. They're mostly different in administration. So a cooperative model is where you will have a host school district who is the one that employs the staff, and handles all of kind of the administration of it, and then they have member school districts who will partner with them, and they will provide services for kind of all of those districts. But you have the one district who is the one responsible and who is then getting transfers from those member districts to help pay for it. Whereas an interlocal is where districts will band together and create a third-party entity that is governed by a board of directors, of which each district would have one member, and this independent entity is then the one who hires the staff, has the facilities, et cetera, to provide the services to all of those member districts. So again, at the end of the day, all the services are delivered, but there is a little difference in kind of how you see budgetarily how it's handled and kind of how those governance are. For the models. And so then moving into funding for how all of this is paid for is school districts primarily receive their funding for special education from kind of 5 main sources. So the federal government provides some special education funding. There is some elements of Medicaid or Medicaid reimbursement for some elements. State institutions provide a very kind of small amount in the grand scheme of things. Most recently, some of the district's local option budget, essentially the amount of their local option budget that they derive from their state special education aid is required to go into their special education fund, and then the bulk that they receive is from the state special education aid. Since these are required services, if all of that aid that they get from the state and the feds and everything else is not enough to cover the services, then the districts do still have to provide them, and that is where you'll hear about them transferring money from their supplemental or their local option budget or other sources that's kind of general education funding to cover whatever that gap might be. And that is where kind of drives into where we get to with excess cost. So state law has that the legislature shall reimburse school districts up to 92% of their excess cost. And this is where I will get to the green handout that you have that has a bunch of steps on it. And so to get to determining what this excess cost is, the idea is that it is money that the districts are spending in excess of a normal student, quote unquote, normal student's education to educate these students. And so as you will see here, I used very fake, very low numbers, so hopefully nobody looks at this and thinks that this is a real district or anything actual. But it kind of walks through and helps you show, especially given that we revised this formula last year a little bit. So I'll just kind of quickly walk through. And again, I guess I didn't state it, but I'm happy to take questions at any time that the chair would like, or just kind of at the end of this. So the first step that we begin at is looking at and seeing what is the unweighted FTE of the school district. And I'll be getting into school finance tomorrow, but as a refresher, if you're unaware, when we talk school finance, we do a full-time equivalent of students rather than the head count. So if a student is only at the school for half the time, they are a half FTE because they're only in the building for half of what a full-time equivalent student would be. So first you would figure out what is the total amount of that total weighted FTE for, well, in this case, this is statewide, so for all school districts. And then you would exclude a variety of weightings from that weighted. And I apologize if I said unweighted. Again, there's a lot of elements, but you take the total weighted FTE, and then you would subtract the weightings that are added for special education, bilingual, transportation, career and technical education, and at-risk students. You would then take that weighting, you would take what you get from that, and you would multiply that by the base state aid. So in this example, by the time we subtract those, you would have 70 FTE. Let's say base state aid was $25, so you'd be at $1,750. You would then divide that by the total number of FTE equivalent pupils in all school districts as of September 20th. So that is taking just the total FTE that's not weighted by anything, and the attempt is to figure out essentially what is the amount of funding per student in this instance. So you do that and it comes to $35. You would then take your total FTEs of special education students, for this example 15, multiply it by that $35, and that gets you the idea of what is kind of, again, that quote normal cost of education for a student and how much of is being provided for those special education students. You would then, at this point, also multiply that by the statewide average for the local option or the supplemental budget, which I believe is just over 32%. I just used the statutory maximum of 33%, so that would get you an additional $173 in this example. That is what I was referring to earlier by that percentage that is attributable to the special education state aid. Kind of going in there to also account for that. So you would add those together. Then you would also add together what are the federal special education funds, what is the Medicaid reimbursement and state institution funds, and get all of that in aggregate. So in this case, we're going to say it's $818. Then you take the total expenditures. So again, for the example, 1,000, and you subtract that number that you'd created. So we take 1,000 minus 818, and that $182 that's left is what would be considered excess costs, or costs in excess of that normal education funding and in excess of all of the other forms of funding. You'd then multiply that by 92%, and that is what then would be getting reimbursed to the districts. This is also required to be done at a district-by-district level by KSDE and published each year by January 31st. So that should be coming up, I believe, here shortly with them as well. And so that is, clear as mud, I'm sure, for how you determine the excess cost. And so then we get to distribution. And much like other elements of education funding, how you determine the funding and how you distribute it are not one and the same. So distribution for special education funding is you first have 3 categories that come off the top of what is appropriated. You have what's called catastrophic state aid, which districts can apply for, and basically for, kind of as the name suggests, catastrophic cases or instances where there is just a lot of costs needed for a student or students, any Medicaid replacement state aid, and then a variety, as I list out in the memo, of some travel reimbursements. Those are taken off the top, and then the remaining is then divided by the amount of special education staff FTEs in the state. To basically determine a per educator cost. And then they go district by district and add up how many special education kind of staff FTEs they have. A licensed special education teacher counts as 1. Special education paraprofessionals are 0.4. And they determine what that is and multiply that by what that per FTE number is. Once again, last year changed things up, so there's kind of another element now to this, which is the legislature has now kind of stipulated 2 distribution models. So there's this one I talked about, which is now going to occur for the first $528 million of special education state aid. Anything that's appropriated above that, and I believe for this year it was, I'll let John, 600
total extra $1 million.
Okay, so there's $73 million above that was appropriated. And so the state board determined what they're calling a local contribution model to equalize this as kind of equalization aid. And so they will, my understanding of it is school districts will submit their total special education expenditures, and then subtract the state aid, the federal aid, and Medicaid reimbursements. And then what is left is considered their local contribution, and then they get it proportional. So if a district ends up being 5% of the state's total local contribution, then that district would receive 5% of that pool of equalization aid. And so there's now kind of dual or two different models worth of distribution. And so that kind of deals with that, and then I've already mentioned the report. And so then the final element that I will get to as far as kind of handouts would be the white sheet of paper with the two different colors. So this is me trying to help capture the cycle of both how funding works for special education and how payments work. And so as you'll see, kind of July, if you think about July as the start of the fiscal year, that is going to begin with kind of finishing out the prior one as KSDE continues to do audits and truing everything up, as well as beginning to determine the funding, the distribution amounts. In September, that September 20th is the count date, so that is when districts are going to submit their estimated special education FTE, the different costs, et cetera. October is when the first payment for that fiscal year will go out for special education state aid. And then in November is now, I just found out, when that local contribution is calculated. So that is when that equalization is calculated. November is also when one of our consensus revenue estimating times. So that is one of the 2 times a year where we will revise estimates for education finance in general, but also for estimates of excess cost. December, you get a second payment. January is when the local contribution payment goes out. March is the third. Then March or April, the legislature is typically when the legislature passes a budget that will have those appropriations in it. April, you have a fourth special education state aid payment. April and May is when, somewhere in there is when districts will submit their final report with adjusted estimates for it, as well as KDHE sends the Department of Education the final count for Medicaid replacement aid. And then June is when KSD determines and sends kind of the final special education state aid payment with those adjusted estimates for the fiscal year. So just to kind of help understand, again, you have the two different wheels of how you're determining everything and then when the districts are actually getting paid. So with that, I will stand for questions of that very high-level overview.
I'm sure just like President Heegard, you've covered it all, so there will be no questions, right, committee? All right, questions for Mr. Willis. Senator Petty.
Matthew, thanks for the presentation. I think sometimes it gets a little, it can be confusing anyway, but so you were using district costs for excess costs.
So there is, in statute now, there are 2 formulas, and they're very similar, but you have an excess cost for the state level, which is what the 92% is tied to and what we've traditionally talked about. And then there is also a formula and a requirement for determining district level excess costs. The example I provide is statewide. Again, the district one is pretty similar. It just goes into some details of denoting like how to capture those interlocal payments or things like that. But I mostly was sticking to just the statewide since that is what everything is tied to as far as that 92% and everything else.
Okay, so I don't think I'm more confused than I was. But when you're talking about the statewide, you're talking about excess costs beyond the 92%.
That is, so the statewide, so up until last year with the legislative changes, and even now, when we talk about the 92%, that is of the statewide excess costs, so aggregating all the districts together versus the report that KSDE is to provide by January 31st, where they break it down and say what each district's excess cost is. So the idea with the 92% is the legislature is funding 92% of the excess cost for the whole state, not necessarily worrying about what is each district's. And so when you look, given that, historically we've not hit that 92% mark, you might see where, I know examples that I've heard before in committee is the Olathe School District doesn't actually, ends up bearing more of a burden where they get a lesser percentage of their excess cost in state aid than a different district might. And the idea that there might be some inequities based upon how the distribution model works. And so that's where you have these kind of two elements. The statewide one is what is tied to that 92% and funding. The idea of doing the state aggregate excess cost is funded at 90%. But then this report is focused on trying to determine what is each school district's individual excess cost in that capacity.
Thank you.
Senator Gossage, then Senator Shane.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. So the unknown is always the federal contribution. So you're using the $1,000 just as an amount. Do we have any idea what it may be this year? Is that determined by the whole state, or is that determined per district?
It is, so I do not know what the federal, what the estimate is offhand for the federal this year. I can definitely get that. I know historically it tends to live somewhere in that 10 to 15% range of kind of their calculation. Again, has been discussed multiple times in various education committees. The federal government has the aspiration of that 40%. Usually, historically, it's been kind of somewhere 10 to 15. I think most years it tends to hover somewhere, I believe, a little over 100 million.
13, 14.
Like, 112, 110. Again, I'd be happy to get more exact numbers for you.
So I would think it would be very difficult to try to budget for special education, not knowing how much because that's the factor of the deduction of how much the federal government's going to pay. And then on the Medicaid side, do we have any idea historically what that percentage or that amount has been?
I know recently we've been working more to get a better grasp on that, so I'm happy to follow up and see where we're at kind of on numbers.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Senator Shane.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Willis. Would it be fair to say, and this will be a little bit of a follow-up to Senator Petty's questions, since the basis of the calculation is based off of the overall state special education need, would it be fair to say that some districts receive in excess of what they really need and some districts fall short? I'm trying to understand how some could fall short if we're estimating it off of the total, I don't want to say burden, but the total estimated need for special education. How does that all balance out? Yeah, so I think part of the difficulty is when we've been doing this, when I've been doing this in the past some too, is the formula is one that is meant to capture statewide and doesn't always fully compute onto districts. So when you look at the administration models, like for an interlocal, most of those school districts in the interlocal aren't actually employing all of the FTEs, which is how it is then distributed. And so then it becomes an element of that interlocal attempting to, for lack of a better word, kind of distribute those FTEs they employ to say, well, this district is responsible for X amount of these that we employ, as well as where you get some of the pass-through with funds, as it's just the way it's administered is a little muddier when you try and get down at a district level with this formula. And so I think that's where it's trickier because, again, you're calculating actual expenditures, but you're distributing it based upon employed staff at each district. And that doesn't appear to be a great kind of level balance for trying to determine that. So I think you just get a bit more noise where, yeah, some districts might appear to have more, might appear to have less because it's not an exact science. Yeah, so that kind of leads down to my next question is how is it determined how the amount of money that a school district will receive for special education funding? So is it is it tied at all to their percent state aid for their local option budget? Is it just purely tied to the FTEs? Or what's the basis for what determines what a district is distributed?
Yeah, so you have several. And so that's where, again, so the legislature appropriates it. So again, we'll say it's around that 600 million that it is for this year is, so first, if the district was, had applied and received anything for the catastrophic aid, has any Medicaid reimbursement, or qualifies for any of those travel reimbursements, those come off the top of the number before anything is calculated. You then take out the amount that was in excess of the 528 million that goes through KSDE's new local contribution equalization. And then what is left of that, then you take and divide it by, if there's 1,000 special education FTEs across the state, you would divide it by 1,000. And that number you get is then essentially, and it again is prorated because we're not at the 92%. That is the amount then that KSDE looks at a district and would say, okay, you have 5 special education FTEs between licensed teachers and paras. So this, whatever that number is times 5, that is the remainder of your special education state aid. And so it's the bulk of it is still distributed by kind of that element of how many FTEs does your district either employ, or again, with some of the interlocals and stuff is attributed to it for that sake, versus what is the actual expenditures. And again, you can get where with interlocals, that district itself might not actually be expending more than what it's sending to the interlocal, and so you might not be able to capture those expenditures truly as well. But most of it is tied to that, what staff are you employing? But again, I might also defer, KSDE might have some better insight than what I do, or at least some more nuanced for those determinations.
Committee, other questions? I have just a couple real quick ones, Mr. Wills. So you keep saying excess cost or an expenditure. What's the definition of expenditure that's counted?
So my understanding is when we are capturing it, it is expenditures made out of a school district's special education fund. So all special education expenditures should come out of that fund. So if a district needs to use general education money, you will see them transferred into the special education fund and expended out of there for special education purposes. I do not believe that there is a greater definition as far as capturing anything beyond that.
So is it fair to say that there's not consistency across districts as to what they're counting as an expenditure to be calculated for excess cost?
I'm not.
Some might count brick and mortar, some might count, because it's not defined in law, correct?
I defer that to KSDE. I've not looked enough in depth at district accounting to be able to generalize what they do or do not count as expenditures.
Okay, my next question is, where did the 92% come from?
So the
Did we land on that number?
Yeah, so the 92% is in state law. It came out of, and I'll look at Tamara for this, the Montoy decision, which was kind of the big school finance one prior to Gannon. Beyond that, my understanding from talking to Bert, who is one of the special education leads at KSDE, was that it was a number that was kind of used when calculating it in the 90s as far as kind of just a general policy decision and everything. And then with Montoy, they just took that number that had been traditionally being used and put it into statute.
So it's not necessarily a magic percentage that correlates to a level of funding that we would expect to see improved outcome for those students.
I'd say it is a policy decision like any other school funding is between court decisions and the legislature's will.
Committee, other questions? Senator Petty.
Madam Chair, wouldn't it be a little hard to use it for any kind of a waiting when we haven't funded it except for maybe 1 year or so? If we're talking about growth, I mean, I don't know how we could ever use that number. I mean, we as a body, legislative body, put that number into statute, but we as a body have also made the decision not to fund it, so.
with all due respect, Senator, I think there's more complication to that, and we will get into that. That's a great segue into our next couple of meetings because we will be looking specifically at the school finance formula. I know that maybe some of the newer members have not seen some of the data around special education that was alluded to, but that as we go into the budget discussion, we will see some of the areas that will arise that I think will shed some light on exactly how this funding works, and going into a new school finance formula that we know we have to craft. I hope it will be helpful to the committee and to everyone listening. So thank you, Mr. Willis, for presenting that information. Committee, any other questions? We will meet tomorrow. It will not be special education funding again. It will be on school finance formula. So with that, we are adjourned.